Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Connect to the world with special Turkish Airlines fares. Book your flight before November 30th and take advantage of great deals. Fly to the most exciting destinations with the award-winning airline that flies to more countries than any other. Terms and conditions apply. For more details, visit TurkishAirlines.com. Turkish Airlines, widen your world.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, Portland City Hall reporter for the Oregonian Oregon Live, and your host today. For more than a decade, Oregon forecasters have underestimated the strength of the state's economy and the amount of money it collects each year. That's led to tax rebate windfalls for Oregon residents who receive a portion of excess revenue under the state's unique kicker law. It's also left state lawmakers with less money to spend on schools, healthcare, transportation, and other budget priorities. All of this may change now that Oregon's hired a new state economist who is reforming the model his office uses to predict the state's finances. Joining me today to talk about the impacts of this change, or potential impacts of this change, is my colleague, business reporter Mike Rogoway. Mike, thanks so much for making a few minutes for me today.
Yeah, glad to be here, Shane.
So it's hard for me to imagine a single taxpayer in the state of Oregon who's not aware or familiar of our kicker law that exists here in Oregon. But perhaps you could talk a little bit about the sort of the mechanics or specifics of Oregon's kicker and why on earth do we have it to begin with?
Yeah, well, it's one of these weird only in Oregon things. The kicker is uniquely Oregon, and it dates back decades. And forgive me, I'm not going to know the time period, but the idea.
I think it's 1979.
1979. Okay, excellent. And I guess I do know that because I have revenue forecasts going back that far in front of me. So the idea is it essentially puts a ceiling on state spending. And the idea is that in Oregon, we have these 2-year budget cycles. And at the start of the 2-year budget cycle, the state economists look ahead and they predict the economy. They look into a crystal ball and they say, this is how the economy will be over the next 2 years. This is how much tax revenue the state will collect as a result. And that's what the legislature can budget to spend. If they underestimate how much money the state will have to spend, if the state collects more than it anticipated because the economy is better than anticipated, then we have a windfall. And in other states, that's money the legislature can then spend. But in Oregon, if it's more than 2% more than expected, then we have this kicker refund. We kick it back to the taxpayers. And for the better part of, we said 1979, so for the better part of 30 years or so, the kickers were occasional and were rather small. But over the past 7 years or so, well, really for the past dozen, the state economists have consistently underestimated the performance of Oregon's economy. And for the past 7 years, the kicker has been large, like really large. In this last budget cycle, it was $5.6 billion. So for some families, that meant thousands of dollars coming back to them, something like 40% of their income tax bill.
Right. If I recall correctly, with this $5.6 billion with a B dollar kicker, I'm trying to recall the amount precisely, but it was something in the ballpark of like $1,000 kicker coming back to sort of the median taxpayer.
Yeah, it's a substantial windfall, and whether that's good or bad depends on your political perspective, Oregonians love the kicker. It's not going anywhere, I don't think.
Right.
People love this windfall, but it had never been that large. It had never been close to that large before. And the downside of it is if the state's collecting a lot more money that it doesn't actually have access to, that's less money it has to spend on public services. Well, is it better to send it back to taxpayers or better to spend it on public services? That's the eternal debate.
I mean, that's the tension right there. But at this point, what is sort of your understanding, or at least the state's understanding, for why over the course of the last decade or so, the state forecasts have been consistently pessimistic in terms of the amount of revenue, or essentially tax money, that was going to be collected by the state? I mean, because as you pointed out in your most recent reporting, this has been going on now year after year for a decade.
Yeah. So this has been something that the state has been aware of. Public employee unions and Democrats have been increasingly concerned about. And there have been a few explanations over the years. There was concern about how the economists use a financial model, an economic model, to predict the state's performance in the coming 2-year cycle. And one issue that I think people have acknowledged there's been problems with the model, one of which was how it handled tax brackets. I think people felt that had been addressed. There was concern about how it handled inflation, and that because we went in sort of a low inflationary period from the early to mid 80s up until the pandemic's immediate aftermath, people felt the model didn't appropriately handle inflation. There are a couple other considerations for why it had been doing badly, according to the new state economist. And his explanations are one, that the way the economic model syncs up to the national forecast produced a more pessimistic outlook. Another way to look at it might be it's sort of predicting a recession, is always out there, and no recession materialized. That was sort of a modeling issue. We'll talk in a minute about other factors over the past few years. The other is a mechanical issue in the way the way the economic model handled the kicker itself. And the kicker, the economic model, apparent that the way they'd chosen to account for whether the kicker was a credit or liability in their model, apparently in ways that I'm not totally clear on, and I think state lawmakers want more information about this too, created this kind of weird feedback loop where it was consistently underestimating the state's economic performance, or the amount of revenue that was going to come in. And apparently that flaw in the model sort of fed on itself and was produced, a big miss produced subsequent big misses. Had impacts down the road. And I think we need a better understanding of what happened there. I do think it's important to say that, one other factor in why the kicker has been so large in the past couple of years is that economists in Oregon and everywhere else in the United States and the world badly misjudged the effects of the pandemic. I think people thought there would be a sharp, sustained economic downturn. But what happened was a sharp, brief economic downturn followed by a long, very robust expansion. And that was fueled in part by the stimulus payments, expanded unemployment benefits, payments directly to businesses to keep them open during the pandemic. Those in turn fed into inflation, and nobody quite understood what was happening at the time. I think people now clearly see what happened, but as a result, the state was bringing in more revenue, both because the economy was performing better and because inflation was driving up prices and wages.
And let me ask you this question, Mike. Covering local Portland government here on my beat, both Portland City Hall and Multnomah County government, in the last couple of years, forecasters in both those government bodies also missed the mark quite substantially. Like their forecasts were way below what ended up being the money the local coffers pulled in, primarily because they were not anticipating a fairly dramatic increase in the city and county's business licensing tax. And I'm wondering if sort of business receipts in particular have been a contributing factor to sort of the better than expected revenues brought in by the state.
Yes, definitely. That definitely has been a component. My understanding of the most recent forecast, it's personal income taxes more than business taxes that affected it. And I think that has to do with the difference perhaps between where state and city government get their money. But yes, that's definitely been a component of what's happened.
And so you kind of made this note in your most recent story, sort of referring to the state economist as a fairly low-profile job, but one that has a tremendous impact on the state, and clearly, with regard to whether or not residents are going to receive tax kickers. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the position itself, and how you sort of square kind of the relatively little visibility this role has versus what its impact can be in Oregon.
Yeah, well, let's start by naming the new state economist who was hired in September. And I may mispronounce his name, and I apologize if I do. It's Carl Rogoway. He'd previously been at Deutsche Bank, Bloomberg, and the big European bank, BNG Paribas. I may be mispronouncing that too. But the state economist, the significance of that role, every state or most states have something like this, an office that forecasts the state budget. The state economist is particularly important in Oregon because that forecast helps determine how much money the state is going to have available to spend. Not just in other states, more money came in, so we'll find somewhere to spend it in the next budget cycle or whatever. We'll just carry it over. Or less money came in than we expected, so we'll have to make a cut. In Oregon, if you underestimate how much is going to come in, it creates a ceiling on how much can come in, no matter how good the times end up being. The excess money is going to be kicked back to people, and in robust times like good economic times like what we're enjoying now. It's in some ways sort of an academic. I won't say that, but it doesn't create a crisis. I think concerns about the critiques of the kicker are when you have an unexpectedly good economic cycle followed by an unexpectedly bad one. So you had perverse outcomes at times when the state is cutting its budget because it's entered a recession that people didn't anticipate. At the same time, it's sending refunds from the prior budget cycle back to taxpayers. So you have the situation where you're laying off public employees, cutting back on education, cutting back on services, while at the same time you're giving people a tax refund. Critics of the kicker say that's an undesirable outcome.
Right.
But it illustrates why that forecast is so important, why the state economist's forecast is so key to determining the state's economic fortunes.
And let me ask you this, and I don't know if this is something that you can answer or if there has been speculation about this, but we did have Rick Anana's predecessor leave his post after a number of years as the state economist. Did the kind of consistent pessimistic forecasting or the model being so off from what revenues were collected by the state have anything to do with his departure?
Not as far as I can tell. The prior state economist, Mark McMullen, left. He works now for a think tank that essentially critiques government operations. I've had no indication that he was pushed out. His deputy, Josh Lehner, left for a job at advising a large private economics consultancy. I've had no indication from either of them, and I've talked to them since, that they felt any pressure that anyone told them to leave. That said, there certainly was unhappiness among public employee unions and among legislative Democrats that the forecast had been consistently low and that we'd produce these large kickers. Whether that in their own mind reduced their job satisfaction and prompted them to leave, it's possible. I just don't know. They have not said that. But certainly when we mentioned the new state economist, Carl Riccadonna, when reporters were talking to him on Tuesday evening and when he presented his report Wednesday to a state legislative committee, he said his job, his charge, his mandate was to produce accurate forecasts and to figure out why the old forecasts were wrong, to dig into them and see what was wrong about the model. And so he came up with some conclusions. He was at pains to say, both to the reporters and to the legislators, that he wasn't saying that his predecessors had screwed up in some way. He said that they didn't understand the future, which is something, what he does. Nobody can predict the future.
Well, I mean, and he says, some people can.
Well, perhaps.
There are people that have actual crystal balls.
Yeah, soothsayers are really good at this. But, he says, looking back now, we can see some things that they could not have seen looking forward. Now, I think it's impossible to tell. I think everyone is being nice to one another. I know economists have differences of opinion about how you interpret data. So everyone may have their own perspective on this. But nobody is saying publicly, at least, that the predecessors were doing anything wrong. They're saying, let's learn from our experience and refine the model. And we also don't know at this point whether the new economic team will do better. They say we've changed the model in the following ways, and we expect to produce higher forecasts going forward, and as a result, smaller kickers. Is that actually going? Is it actually going to be more accurate? The model will be put to a test starting now. The first forecast with the new team came out Wednesday, and so it'll be. We'll have some indication in 3 months, but it'll probably be at least a few years before we have clear indication of whether the new model is performing better.
But I think the big question here is, assuming that the economic forecasting model gets refined, fine-tuned, and can more closely predict what revenues are coming in for the state. That essentially means that the days of record high tax rebates for Oregon residents would come to an end, correct?
Shane, we have buried the lead, as we say in this conversation. Yes, you're exactly right. We are accustomed to these very, very large rebates, and that's if they're successful, we will have smaller kickers or none at all most of the time going forward. There's another potential implication. The goal is that if you're shooting at a dartboard, you won't miss by very much. But if you do miss, you'll miss to the right sometimes, you'll miss to the left sometimes. Well, what Oregon has been doing, state economists for more than a decade now, is underestimating. But if they overestimate revenue coming in, then there's something maybe even more unpleasant than to lawmakers than paying out money that they feel state programs need.
Budget cuts.
Cut those budget cuts. Now, now there is sort of a silver lining there. Oregon has substantial reserves, of $5.4 billion in budgetary reserves, something like 19% of the general fund. Because the economy has been so good for so long, we really haven't had a sustained downturn of any kind, just a very brief pandemic downturn since the Great Recession, well over a decade. So Oregon has built up, the substantial reserve. So if they do overshoot the mark, it's possible that the reserves could cover that.
Point of clarification here, Mike. We hear so often within the discourse or conversation around Oregon's unique kicker is that we don't, as a result, Oregon has no rainy day fund. But when you're talking about a $5.4 billion reserve, that's essentially a rainy day fund, correct?
It does in fact have that name. That is what the state calls it, is a rainy day fund. They also have a school stability fund.
Right.
And so, yes, some years ago, I don't want to give credit to the wrong administration, but I think this was a Kulongoski thing. You know, I don't cover the state legislature day to day. I don't cover state government day to day, but that's my recollection. It goes back to Kulongoski that people realized that this was an issue and we needed to start building up a rainy day fund as well as the school stability fund.
Right.
And their timing was perfect. They started doing it at a time when we were headed into this long period of economic expansion. And as a result, we have a substantial reserve. So if state economists miss the mark and overestimate the amount of revenue that's coming in, the reserves might help cover that. In fact, in all but the worst situations, they would. So I think there's one other thing, Shane, that we haven't talked about with these forecasts that make them particularly, two other things that make them particularly difficult. One is that many states use a one-year budget cycle. So if they screw it up one year, well, they have a chance to correct it the next year. Right. Oregon has a 2-year budget cycle. So they have to predict 2 years out in the future. You know, back right now it's 2024. Back in 2022, I don't think people had a clear idea of the severity or the duration of the inflation that was emerging. Right now, try to predict what things look like in the middle of 2026, halfway through the new Trump administration. What are tariffs going to mean to the state economy? What's going to happen with the war in Ukraine? What will happen with oil prices? What's going to happen in the Middle East? All these things are very hard to gauge 2 years out, and what effect they may have on Oregon's finances. But this is a prediction that our state economists have to make. They may have to predict 2 years in the future. The other thing that makes predicting the future revenues particularly difficult in Oregon is that we are more dependent on personal income tax revenue than almost any other state, maybe more dependent than any other state. We have no sales tax in Oregon, no general sales tax. So the general fund is supported largely by personal income taxes, which are very volatile. They go up and down based on quite a bit, based on what's happening in the economy, whether there are layoffs, whether there are wage cuts, or vice versa, whether there's inflation and wages are going up, corporate profits are going up, even if they're going up because of inflation. They're still going up for purposes of setting, the kicker threshold. So, it is a difficult job the state economists have, for sure.
Not an easy gig. Well, Mike Rogoway, thanks so much for your time and the conversation with you today.
Yeah, glad to be here, Shane.
Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to the Oregonian Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time.